You know, when I was preparing remarks, I went back and looked at a couple of times when I've spoken to Jeff in interview form, and I realized we've only done really the two of us have only done 2 interviews, but they were both remarkable in that the last one we did, you were very kind to share some of the ups and downs of your business in a way that got a lot of people in the industry talking about some of the realities of the comics business. And then the previous time we talked, the cartoonist Dave Sim wanted to beat you up for about 8 years. So we have a lot to learn.
For about 8 years, that's right.
Yeah. So I'm hoping maybe for a half sibling or a, kind of an attack, something, really remarkable and dramatic tonight. So
I just found out that Kate Beaton and I are related. That's sort of a half sibling thing.
There you go.
That's not bad.
There you go.
Is this really loud? This sounds really loud to me. Is it? It is really loud. Do I have any control over that?
It's all me, sorry.
So how's that? Is that a little better?
I have some visual aids to go, or like some pictures to go with some of the questions I have, and just a series of questions covering the breadth of your career. I do have an unvarnished record. At some point, I will probably put up art that has nothing to do with you, or that's like bad art. So we can all look for that. That's something that we have going on. They gave me like a little remote here. I feel like we're in the rec room, but
I do. I like these 1969 chairs. These are pretty cool.
I wanted to ask you. We're here in Columbus. This feels to me like a very Columbus event, and you being kind of the face of Columbus comics, if not North American comic books at this point. But I really think of you when I think of Columbus and I think of comics. Do you think of yourself as an artist kind of this region, of a Midwestern artist? Do you feel like you're a Columbus artist? Do you feel a kinship with the artistic community that's here?
Yeah, very much so. If you've read Bone, you live here, if you lived here for very long, and you've ever been to Hocking Hills, you're going to know that Old Man's Cave is where Bone takes place. And yeah, this is where I'm from, and it's the kind of trees I like to draw. It's the kind of rolling hills. We're only 35 miles from the Appalachian foothills here in Columbus, and you get down into Lancaster, and it's a gorgeous kind of a look, and that's what I like to draw. I used to go to Old Man's Cave as a kid. My parents would take me there, and it's so beautiful and strange and unlike anything else that we have around here. But I used to not only just climb around on the rocks and play, but man, my imagination would just go crazy. Even as I got older, and I would start to picture, read heavy metal or read Lord of the Rings or something. Start picturing, what kind of stories and fantasies could go on there, which is actually what Bone became in the end.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm definitely part of this place for sure.
Yeah, and as far as the other artists, were there artists around, or people, a kind of artists that you liked, or role models in terms of just art, perhaps teachers that you had when you went to school, or
well, not for comics really. I mean, that's comics were.
Well, not comics so much, but even just artists, just in general, just kind of people that. What made you think, or what made you kind of? Were there people that helped? Were they sort of role models that helped you kind of conceptualize yourself as an artist?
The closest thing I can think of was my best friend in elementary school and high school and college was this guy named Jim Kemmerard, and he and I were comic book crazy. We just liked all the same kinds of things. We liked animation. We were always trying to find a new kind of a tool or a new kind of paper to write on. Always discovering new artists and new techniques. Not all of it was in comic books. We also liked painting and things like that. So it was really the two of us that spurred each other on. And of course, occasionally would have a teacher that got it. Most teachers were like, "Why are you drawing on your math test?" Or even art teachers never really, I'm talking about high school, never really kind of appreciated it. And especially, I'm talking about in the 70s, it was really uncool to do comics back then. So yeah, I think we just inspired each other. There was no one. You're talking about like in my real life. Right?
Yeah.
You're not talking about like I was reading Charles Schultz and going, I think that's awesome.
Well, I wonder if there weren't role models, like direct role models or direct people that kind of gave you permission to be an artist or kind of led the way for you to be an artist. Maybe you did project onto public artists like Schultz and stuff. I just wonder, because like you said, in the 70s, it was a difficult thing. It wasn't something that I think a lot more people are naturally inclined towards careers in the arts now, just generally.
Oh,
so
and in comics.
And in comics specifically. So I just kind of wondered, when you kind of decided, or what you were looking at that kind of made, I could maybe do that, or I could do something close to that.
It was reading comics. I mean, I was absolutely in love with comics, and even from a very early age, I was aware that there was a hand behind it. Okay. That Charles Schultz was drawing and writing Snoopy, and that Walt Disney was in charge of Mickey Mouse, And also, I had my parents were both artistic, although neither of them really did a lot. They had regular jobs. My mom would do paintings and sell them in local gift shops, and she still paints and goes around to the different art leagues and stuff and does those shows. But mostly they were just encouraging. They were never discouraging. Let me put it that way. My dad used to actually read Mad Magazine to me. He loved Mad Magazine. What a great dad. Because Mad Magazine, when I was a kid, Mad Magazine was the doorway to seeing what was really going on. Because in the 60s, there was, television, and I liked it, but it was really stupid, like Bewitched and Gilligan's Island and Mr. Ed. Mr. Ed, for fuck's sake. But what was worse were the television commercials. Television commercials, do you think they're bad now? I guess they're always bad. Television commercials are just terrible. But as a kid, I couldn't understand why it was happening. Why are these people so stupid on this? Why are they actually doing what they're doing? And Mad Magazine explained that. Mad Magazine would show you that there were guys, on Madison Avenue writing this stuff and trying to trick you. And that was very liberating to me.
Sure.
So Mad Magazine and also Peanuts in 1966. How many places are you going to really read something about what kids actually think, what their interior lives are like? Charlie Brown was out on the playground experiencing real feelings. And I don't, so to me, comics were a place where you could really experience, where I could see some real things being said.
I wanted to take you to the first issue of Bone, and kind of past your because you were in your early 30s when the first issue came out, so you'd had a career by then.
Yeah, so don't panic, guys.
You'd done some animation.
Don't panic.
But I'm really fascinated by the thought of you doing that first issue, because doing a comic book at that time, doing that kind of comic book at that time, is a really
stupid,
strange and wonderful choice that you made. And it's not an easy form to get. There weren't schools for comics. What do you remember about the actual making of comic book pages for that first issue?
That's a really good question. Well, I owned an animation studio, so I was used to doing a lot of drawings and trying to keep them on model. And animation, even though it wasn't my first love was comic strips. And I learned the art of comic books from reading Walt Kelly and Pogo and Peanuts and Carl Barks. But animating in my 20s, where you sit and you draw and you stare into, this was back when we did it by hand. You stare into a light bulb for hours and hours and just draw thousands and thousands of drawings. And it forced you to see a two-dimensional drawing three-dimensionally, because you had to turn a character and you had to think. And when someone had to have an expression or a thought, you really had to think through, what's the interior thing coming out that's making those faces. And a lot of that did actually end up going into my comics. But as far as doing the first page, wow. I do remember that the very first thing I had to do was tell my wife that I wanted to sell my animation company and do Bone as an underground comic. She took it pretty well. She's making a face at me right now. But again, I was very lucky in that I married a woman who loved cartoons, loved comics. To this day, we've been together for 30 years. We still can talk shorthand and say things from either The Simpsons or Yosemite Sam, and we know what each other's talking about. She encouraged me, and at some point I had to figure out how to do the pages, and at first I was still doing them on the side. So I just found some pads of paper. The OSU's library, it's now called the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum. Fantastic place. You should go across town and check it out if you're interested in cartoons. And found in the basement of the journalism building, this nascent form of the library where the curator there, Lucy Caswell, would let me look through original art. So that's how I figured out how thick the paper should be, because it was pretty consistent.
Sure.
That most cartoonists use 2-ply Bristol board. They used India ink. They used white pencil. They all clearly put their coffee cups on their original art. And so I saw all the great unwashed secrets of original art by looking at original art. So then when I actually did it, I do remember sitting on the kitchen table in Vijaya's in my apartment, and really trying to figure out. You have to draw the first page. You got to start drawing, outlining the boxes and really going through it. I actually drew the first page twice, inked it twice. Because the first time I thought it was good, and then I finished it, and I thought it wasn't exciting enough to be the first page. And so I changed the dynamic. The thing that's on the first page is like the 3 bones are out in the desert, and one, the phony bone, the selfish, cranky one, is like crying about something himself, I'm sure. But I had them, just the 3 of them kind of lined up in the splash panel of the first page. And so I scrapped it. I still have it, but I scrapped it. And threw phony bone way into the foreground and threw them into the back. And suddenly I had a much more dynamic page. So I do remember it was just really paying attention and struggling through the whole process.
Now, it took you a while to build an audience for the comic book series as you were putting out issues. But do you remember the first time you heard back from someone, like a voice in the wild that wasn't like a friend or someone that you knew before, when you just kind of realized that your work had reached someone out there?
Yeah, and I can tell you that story. But before I just want to say that Vijaya, I told her the whole story. Bone was intended to be a long story, and it had an ending. From the beginning, I knew someday it would be a single graphic novel. And I told her the ending and told her the whole story, and she liked it, so she had confidence in it. So that kind of set my mindset in the right place as I went forward. Okay, so the thing with comic books, especially back then, you would put out an issue, you send it to the printer, and it might be a couple of months before it gets into the store. So I had actually done, I think, 3 issues of Bone before the first one was even out.
Right.
And it was when the 3rd one came out, I got a phone call from, do you know Mark Asquith?
Yeah, sure.
Mark Asquith, he works for the Canadian Sci-Fi Channel now.
Right.
But he used to do this show called Prisoners of Gravity.
That is Prisoners of Gravity.
Yeah, do you remember that?
It was a very early geek show.
Covered
geek
And
subjects.
he called and was saying, I'm a television producer. We do a show about comics, and I really love your comic. And I'm like, get out of here. I mean, come on. Oh, what a silly thing, right?
Yeah.
But he said, I'm going to send you, he said, I really like your comic. He was the very first person that contacted me. And he sent me a videotape. It came a couple weeks later, but I plugged it in and I watched the show. And it was all about a budding superstar named Neil Gaiman, who was just getting going at that time also. But Neil Gaiman was just becoming super hot. So I watched this interview, and he had told me, whatever you do, watch it all the way to the end. So at the end, he says, so Neil, is there any books you want to read? And Neil turns to the camera and he goes, some guy just gave me like the first 3 issues of Bone, and I read them in the airport, and I love them. And he just went on. He went on for like 30 seconds, and I think Vijay and I were like, what? What? What is happening? They're talking about Bone on television. Oh my God, it was Neil Gaiman. So anyway, I gave Neil my first child.
I wanted the reason I brought up this piece of art, and one of the ways I think your animation and kind of strip background that they kind of there was a confluence of them, is that very early on, the very early issues of Bone, there's a constant reassurance of character. You hit the characters really hard, and you always give them character moments, and you're very firm about establishing those characters. I mean, wasn't that part of like the strip background that you had, the animation background, that you wanted to really establish these archetypal characters every chance you could? It seems very graceful the way you did that over and over
Well,
again.
thank you. Well, the idea was, but you're right. I came from reading Pogo, Peanuts, and Uncle Scrooge by Carl Barks. And in all those, they assume they're getting new readers every day.
Right.
So it was kind of ingrained in me as I would read these comics that that's kind of what they did. I mean, Uncle Scrooge was a miser who believed in hard work, and yet he would do anything to protect his fortune, including cheat. And that miserly, greedy character was reestablished, in every issue.
In every issue, sure. Yeah.
And it's the same way with any kind of comedic thing like that with the Marx Brothers or the Stooges. I mean, you know who those characters are, and they're archetypes. They're a certain kind of play they make.
I just thought that set you apart, I think, at the time, because you hit those marks so solidly, whereas a lot of independent comics at that time were very inscrutable. I mean, there was a kind of, a fantasy lives in your head for so long, when you finally get it down on the paper, you're the only guy who understands it. But you were very...
Who cares about it?
Well, you were very clear about trying to communicate, very forceful about trying to communicate step by step, and you were very deliberate very early on.
I was. Again, the only person who knew that the whole story was Vijaya, and she's also the only one who knew that it was supposed to be one book. Because in 1991, the concept of a graphic novel was misunderstood at best. You had Mouse, Watchmen, and Dark Knight, and of course Contract with God. But by 1991, Contract with God was fading from consciousness. It's kind of been rescued, thank goodness. But most graphic novels were just one-shots. They weren't kept in print any more than a comic book was, except for like those three, and nothing really had followed on after that. And we looked at the comic book market, Vijay and I, and we thought, well, in order to sell this, we thought the worst idea would be to say, this is going to be a giant 300-page Tolkien-esque trilogy, or a fantasy, because, especially in 1991, Tolkien had not made his resurgence again yet. And there were so many bad fantasies that were just like, an elf and a dwarf marching through the woods with swords. And I hate that kind of shit. I hate it. And I did not want anybody to think that's what this was. So I felt like the best thing would be to make it like a Donald Duck comic.
Right.
And keep people coming back by being humorous and having fun adventures and having a little mystery. But even from the very beginning, I began planting little seeds and clues that were going to go for the bigger story. Did that answer your question?
That totally answered the question.
Okay.
I don't know.
And also, I thought it was funny that if you wanted eggs, you'd have to woo the...
You might be looking at this for a long time.
All right, well, let's
talk some more about this.
That's a pretty good drawing. Are you having trouble?
Yeah, it's like my remote at home. I start banging on it at some point. I don't know if there's anything can be done.
Can we? No, we are not having work.
Do I need to shout like beep? Oh, a lot of what was in some of the early, and the next one too is also the same way, where you have these set pieces where they're very, you have a very strong sense of scene. Like there's these little moments in the story that are very remarkable. I mean, how important was you to kind of construct memorable scenes, memorable story moments to kind of carry what went forward? Like when you had this remarkable hiding scene, it's a little later in the saga, did you know like this was kind of a cool moment and kind of went back and kind of reinforced that?
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was. The way I write is certain images or concepts or ideas or scenes I kind of have them in there, and I don't know exactly how I'm going to get to them, but I'm going to want to. And this was an idea of, I wanted to do a comic that took exactly the same amount of time to read as what the characters were experiencing. So they start at one end of a thunderstorm forest, and they're being chased by monsters, and they run to the other end of the forest, and the amount of time it took to read that comic was the amount of time they were in the forest. And I also thought, you don't need to explain everything. I'm a big fan of moving the story along with the images. So if you can do something without words, if you can just, I mean, there's sound effects there, but
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know if a tableau is the right word or a scene, but I did picture like this. It'd be fun to like have a panel and have the exact same panel, but you can see in the distance with the lightning and stuff.
Well, the next one has a similar, I mean, you were very well known for your comedy scenes pretty early on. The stupid rat creatures moment being one of the all-time memorable kind of comedic scenes, which might be the next image. But I just wonder, you were so confident early on, and you said you weren't hearing back. Was it just the confidence in your wife's reading of the material and just kind of confidence in your own abilities that kept you on?
That was it, honey.
That kept you going? I mean, really? Because the thing that was remarkable, you were very assured very early on, and these scenes where you were kind of hitting these scenes, and
I think in the beginning I didn't have anything to lose, you know.
Right.
I mean, I was just trying it. I knew what kind of comics I wanted to do, and I knew that kind of comics didn't really exist. It was sort of like I wanted to take that kind of traditional Carl Barks' Uncle Scrooge comic, but stretch it out.
Sure.
And make it feel, I don't know, like a Will Eisner comic. You know, give it space and movement and depth. And I just hadn't seen anything like that, and I was just going to do it.
Sure. Now
I was in my 30s too, so I'd been doing TV commercials, so I felt confident that I could turn out something that was at least competent.
Right. Now
I didn't know it was good until later.
You didn't know it was good. Well, we knew right away. I mean, a lot
didn't.
it was pretty remarkable to read those early issues. You know, we mentioned this already, but you started the book at a time that was kind of lousy for comics. It wasn't the best time for comics. And you self-published, you were self-directed, but you also owned, like you said, you owned your own animation studio. It's not like you came from a big factory there. And I don't know that I've ever heard you say, like, what is your impulse, what is your desire to kind of own the company, to also be kind of the man behind the curtain as well as the artist in front of the curtain? What is that impulse with you?
It probably started when I originally wanted Bone to be a newspaper comic strip. You know, I've mentioned Pogo and Peanuts a number of times. That's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a newspaper strip. But I could not sell it to save my life. I completely failed at it. But I got very frustrated with the syndicate editors. They were the gatekeepers, and yet the more and more I talked to them, the more I realized they didn't know shit about comics.
Right.
They really didn't. I'll give you one quick example. I can't remember which syndicate it was, so I won't say in case I have it backwards. But I was talking to two syndicates at the time, and one of them, I mean, for like 2 years they would have me do 2 months worth of strips and send them in.
Sure.
And then about every 6 months they'd bring me out there, and they would have. Okay, here's one note. He goes, have you ever thought about having the characters talk with thought balloons? And I thought, well, they're not mind readers. I don't know what good would that be. And he said, well, Garfield talks in thought balloons. Well, yeah, I guess he does. That's really, really stupid.
That doesn't.
I mean, think about that. Garfield talks in thought balloons, and John, the owner, hears him.
Well, that does.
Well, so that was heartbreaking. That was an actual heartbreaking moment for me. I was like, wow, this is the guy who decides if I'm going to do a comic or not, and he doesn't understand what a thought balloon is.
That does explain the lasagna issue of Bone.
Yeah. Well, but where I was going with that is that that was the moment where I decided I am not going to wait for someone's permission anymore. And I had started up an animation studio with some college buddies. One of them was Jim Kemmerer that I mentioned earlier. That was Marty Fuller, and we we had a medium successful company. So we knew about running a company. We knew about having books and having, doing business as and just, that kind of a thing. And I thought, you know what, that's it. I'm never going to wait for anybody's permission again. I'm going to do this book. Well, I needed Vijaya's permission mostly because I just trusted her. And that was it. She wrote it. We sat down. I told her the story. We came up with the plan not only for the books, but a 5-year business plan. We actually did a 5-year business plan that included, and we wrote this in 1990, that included once a year so that people would be able to get the earlier chapters, that we would collect them into, we called them graphic novels because people were still not that familiar with the term.
Now, you mentioned when that you kind of brought the fantasy element along slowly within the comic. Were you worried? I mean, I remember kind of people did start to notice that this was kind of becoming this.
They were mad about
this comedic kind of set piece comedy fantasy, and it kind of become this epic quest type fan. I mean, but so were you nervous when people started reacting to that?
Yeah, because it's hard to believe now that the Lord of the Rings movies have made more money than anything until the Avengers. That kind of fantasy was pretty looked down upon. And I was already making comic books, so how much more looked down upon did I want to be, yes, I was nervous about it. I was also, I think what you're really getting at is that there was a shift in the tone of the comic, which was greeted with a bit of scorn in some quarters. But it was the plan from the very beginning, so I was going for it.
Well, talk a little bit about fantasy, if you would, because you say you don't like some of the cheaper fantasies or kind of the knockoff fantasies. And I wonder about your approach to fantasy, because it's, in some sense, Bone is a traditional fantasy. There are dragons, and there are elements, and there are princesses, and but there are subversive elements, or elements that speak against it. For instance, the power is kind of settled into the female characters. Thorn is the kind of the heroic protagonist, and the Bones are the sidekicks along for the ride. Did that come from a sense of you wanting to do a fantasy differently, or was this just how you kind of approached this specific story? Did you think about it in terms of?
I did think about it. I had 12 years. I may not have totally understood what I was doing at first.
Okay.
But in 12 years, you have a lot of time to think and figure out, what exactly how is this really going to play out? I mean, I knew it was Phone Bone's story, but I also knew that it was Thorn's story. And the way I split it up in my head was that it's Phone Bone's story, but the actual fantasy hero arc, the sort of the Luke Skywalker or the Percival and the Holy Grail, that story was going to be for Thorn. Because I knew that Phone Bone and his two cousins, Smiley Bone and Phony Bone, were cartoon characters. They're the Marx Brothers. They're not going to change. And if you continue that analogy, it's sort of like A Night at the Opera.
Sure.
The story is the Marx Brothers are just in there. They're the stars, but the story is about the young ingenue and the heroic young man and the evil theater people, right? And then the fun though, but it's only fun when the Marx Brothers are on stage tearing an opera house apart, right? So they were facilitating the young lovers getting together and overcoming their obstacles. So it was that was kind of how I divided it up.
When I reread Bone this time for this presentation, I was kind of struck by the relationships between the Bone characters as a model of friendship. Now, a lot of what, the primary relationship, that Thorn-Phone Bone relationship, and the loyalty that he shows her and the loyalty they show each other is a major arc, or maybe the major arc in the story. But I was kind of fascinated by the relationship between the three Bones, because it's a model for just irritating friendships that we have. There's a forgiveness there, because we have the one guy who's kind of a stalwart, loyal guy, and then a kind of a dumb, oddly genius type guy, and then we have a kind of a rotten guy. But they're very forgiving. They're very matter of fact. And I wondered, if that was something that you modeled on relationships that you had ever, like a kind of forgiving friendship, or kind of this, acceptance of one's kind of nature, which I think
I
is
think
really...
so. I think my friend Jim Cameron was probably that. We had that kind of a very open and frank friendship, where we could get mad at each other, but it was always forgiven. My family's that way too. The Smith family is extremely frank and open and very forgiving. And I do think one of the themes of Bone was loyalty. Family loyalty, friends loyalty. Pick your loyalty. Don't let other people tell you who your loyalty should be or what you should believe.
Talk about the ending of the story in terms of what you wanted people to walk away with in terms of that central relationship, the Phone-Bone-Thorn relationship. There's, the big army, there's a big physical confrontation where the loyalty is sort of tested and they come through, but there's an afterword or an after kind of story where they kind of go back to their lives, and you can tell that relationship has changed Phone Bone, and maybe the way that none of the other characters have changed. And I just wonder, what did you want people to take away from that kind of experience, that central relationship? Mm-hmm. Was it that element that, that relationships change you in that way, or is it?
Yeah, well, it was also part of the, you're asking, if I took the fantasy, very seriously or whatever, but there are actual tropes and symbols and beats in fantasies, and one of them is Dorothy has to go home to Kansas. That's part of what has to happen, and as much as she loved the Scarecrow and the Lion, she had to go. And I got to that point in the book, and Phone Bone had to go. He had to go back home.
Well, we know that Dorothy has a new appreciation of home when she goes home, at least in the movie version. Mm. But what is Phone Bone? How did Phone Bone change then at the end?
Well,
of the story?
I just think the fact that he had to go was very hard, and just saying goodbye is hard. And if you haven't read Bone, this is probably sounding like inside baseball or something. But think of what he did and what he went through, and he had a hell of a year. He got pushed off cliffs. He got chased by dragons, bitten by giant mountain lions.
Sure. Now, you've done some Bone material.
You know what? And his heart was broken. So that's probably what it really was.
Okay. Well, let me ask you. You've done some Bone material since. You've done prose works. You've done related works to the main story with collaborators. There has been some prose material kind of related to the main story, set in that world a little bit. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's not an all or nothing kind of thing with you, that you've had these additional projects, but you haven't done a formal sequel and don't seem headed in that direction or any of those kind of things. So why this middle path? Is it just the individual projects that have appealed to you to kind of do another story set here, set there, and not be, or did you ever think about just shutting it all down, like nothing at all other than the main kind of comic?
I think my original intention was to just shut it down, do the book. I'm not much of a sequel person. There's no sequel to Moby Dick.
Right.
And that was kind of my main model. So I hear tittering out there. Don't worry, I won't talk about it anymore. And I don't want to do a sequel. I have no interest in going back to the world. But the characters, I love them so much. I've drawn them since I was a little kid, and so I find excuses.
Still draw them?
Phone Bone still shows up. Yeah, I draw him especially during RASL. There's a couple of really heavy parts in RASL, and I'll find myself like when I'm writing the scripts. Suddenly, I'll just draw Phone Bone doing something. He's just like, lighten up, dude.
When you finished the story, probably your most high-profile next project or your big project in between your kind of major works. So you did a Shazam or Captain Marvel story for DC Comics, and I wondered what that was like. C.C. Beck is kind of one of the great stylists and one of the great strong creator voices in all of comics history, and all of a sudden you're kind of working in his playground, in his milieu, his visual world. What was that like after kind of generating a world of your own to kind of play in someone else's sandbox, even in the way that you were able to do what you want with that sandbox?
Well, Bone, I worked on Bone for 12 years, finished, started in 91, finished in 2004 sometime. But I started working on thinking of RASL, the next piece,
so
as early as 2000.
Okay.
So I was still thinking about that, and I hadn't quite got all the pieces together that I needed for that story. So as I was getting near the end of Bone, DC Comics contacted me, because most people in comics knew that I was getting near the end. And they said, would you have any interest in doing superhero comics? And I didn't then, and I really don't now. But instead of saying no, I said, well, which one? Because if you'd have said Superman or Batman, or I would have said no, because I have nothing to add to those characters. And if you said Green Lantern or Flash, I'd be like, fuck, well, who cares about those guys? But he said Captain Marvel, which just hit me quite right, because of a couple of reasons. One, he had not gotten that grim and gritty makeover relevancy thing that so many characters had gotten in the 80s and early 90s. And but the other thing was he was like trapped in Augur. This was a character that had not really done anything, he hadn't changed. He was directly connected to the golden age of comics, the early 1940s. And besides, he had a talking tiger, so I thought that was pretty cool. So that was it. And I viewed it as a way to get out from under the shadow of Bone, because emotionally, Bone was just a huge like thing there. Even though I'm probably always going to be the Bone guy, I mean, like personally, it was hard for me to like stop writing like that, to write like I wanted to for RASL. So it was very useful for me to take like a little 1.5 year long project
And I have to imagine it would just, it just kind of took some pressure off the next project, because there was a project in between, kind of.
Exactly. It was. I was describing it as a palate cleanser.
Yeah.
But I thought that might have been too insulting. So, but I didn't mean it that way. I just thought, yeah, it was good. It was a spacer between the two projects that I wanted to have very different flavors for.
So you were thinking of RASL while Bone was still going on.
In 2000.
Did you have other options? Did you have to how did you settle on RASL? Was that the only thing that came to you, or did you sort out?
There were other ideas. Robin Hood was an idea. But RASL was the only one that just really was like, oh, there's something there. And that crazy figure with the primitive mask and the giant engines, and yet he represents like the string theory. There's something about the imagery and the idea that was it was just strong, and it kept coming back.
So it was that image, the image of RASL with the device that allows him to.
He didn't look quite like that.
My
first drawings of him, when I look at him, he looks like it looks almost manga. He looks like a little short Astro Boy type character with really crazy hair.
Right.
And the only thing that kind of survived was the costume and the crazy hair.
Now, was there an element of reconnecting to your love for like 1970s science fiction comics with Mobius and that kind of the heavy metal type stuff? Was that part of it?
I'm sure it was. It was heavy metal that came to the U.S. in '77.
Sure.
Which was Metal Hurlant in France, was Mobius and Drier, and there was a third guy on there. I can't remember. But they were brilliant. It's not the heavy metal of today, which is kind of softcore porn. It was some of the most brilliant genius European artists that were doing grown-up fantasy comics or science fiction stories, but they were using, they were fully painted, or they were just gorgeous techniques. And that was what actually triggered me into wanting to do Bone, the story, because I thought, wouldn't it be great to take like traditional American cartoon characters, like the big nose, 3-fingered Bigfoot characters, and put them in this fantastic grown-up fantasy world, this speculative fiction type world. And I thought that was a really cool idea. That was always there, and yes, RASL would have been something I would have thought would have fit in there.
And this is the RASL set in a desert, the kind of southwestern milieu, and very much modern buildings and everything. How did that develop then? What made it set there after this kind of initial image? Because that's very different than the kind of Columbus just south of Columbus, kind of natural Midwestern feel of your first work. What made you go all the way to that part of the country?
Well, after Columbus, after the Midwest, where I grew up, one of my favorite parts of the country is the Southwest. I went there a few times on vacation with my family. Ever hear of Ghost Ranch in New Mexico?
Sure.
I went. That was the first time I was there, and I was blown away by it. And I've just always been a fan of that. So, also Raytheon is south of Tucson, and part of my story is that RASL's an ex-military engineer who discovers, like in the basement of Wright-Patterson, which was the original Area 51, the lost papers of Nikola Tesla, and blends them with his own work, merges string theory and Nikola Tesla. And actually, it almost really kind of fits. I went a little far down that rabbit hole. But Raytheon is there, and I wanted him to work somewhere like that so he could be a military freelance worker.
Sure.
And also, there's an element of the desert which I think works really well with noir. Even though noir is normally thought of as a city in a maze. Oh, change the slide.
Yeah, I think we're like 100 slides
We were just told,
behind.
you can tell her.
We're like
You wanted to
100
change
slides behind at this point, so we can go. There's where, you were, this is when you were at Image Comics for a while. I mean, do you think that the kind of negotiating that tough landscape of the 90s was a valuable experience? Was that a scary experience? It was really kind of a chaotic business time.
Oh, it was ridiculous, but I think that the self-publishers that survived, we felt like we were almost like mother tigers, and the comics were our cubs.
Right.
And you don't get near it. And we protected them in any way, as fast as we could. And Vijay and I, since it was just the two of us, we've always had 2 or 3 employees. Kathleen has been with us, oh my gosh, 14, how many? 16 years. Please don't ever go. And Tom Gott, who's been with us for over 10 years. We've always had a good team. Steve Hammaker, who's colored RASL, was on staff for a number of years. But we're a small staff, and we could move quickly. We could think on our feet. We could twist. We could turn. Because really, it was just Vijay and I. We'd go, all right, crisis is coming. Train wreck on the way. What do you want to do? And a bigger company would have a harder time stepping out of the way, but we were able to like not only step out of the way, but jump on the train and do whatever we needed to, go to the dining car and have a beer, I guess. I don't know.
Hang out in the observation car for a while. We just saw 3 panels from some of your peers from that time period, like Colleen Doran and Stan Sakai, and this is a Charles Vest painting.
And those guys did all survive.
They were all kind of survivors. I mean, how important was it you to kind of make a connection with other artists that kind of were doing sort of the same thing that you were? Do you remember that as a good time?
I absolutely remember that as a good time. It was one of the most important times. Those people are still some of my closest friends. If Charles ever called and needed anything, Vijay and I would be on a plane immediately.
Sure.
And I still talk to Colleen Doran fairly regularly. We're kind of like inking buddies. Like, because cartoonists. By the way, if you're thinking about being a cartoonist, listen to this next sentence. You have no life. You are inking at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, and you're thinking, I hope Colleen's as much of a loser as I am. And then you encourage each other and just talk on the phone, and you get pages done, and then. So no, it was very important. Also on the road, we would see each other, and all we did was talk. It was a group of us. The original self-publishers, of the self-publishing movement in the 90s, was Dave Sim, me, Colleen, Martin Wagner, and James Owen. But then there was Steve Bissett.
Sure.
And Rick Veitch, and Larry Marder, and Neil Gaiman was, even though he was published by Vertigo, he was kind of doing whatever the hell he wanted, so he was an honorary self-publisher. But we would always get a suite somewhere, wherever the retailers were having a convention or wherever there was some kind of gathering, we would get a suite, and we would hang out in that suite, and all we did was talk about comics.
Sure. Can you keep it going? We can maybe catch up. I have no idea what that was for. I just liked it. That was traditional fantasy elements. That's one of your lovely dragon design and kind of, yeah, it's a dream sequence, but you have dragons in fantasy. I thought that was worth talking. There's another.
Wait, go back to that dragon a second. Can you do that? Can you back one? Okay. So one day, we had a cartoon books booth set up at the San Diego Comic-Con, and I had. It was a huge. Our backdrop was a big picture of Phone Bone with his arms back, riding on the back of the dragon, and a little boy walks by with his dad, and he goes, "Daddy, look, it's a Christmas donkey."
Keep it going until keep it going for a while. That's another traditional kind of fantasy element. There's your female kind of driven fantasy, action fantasy, or the ending, or near the ending, the action part of the ending.
I really like water. I put water whenever something big was happening in Fomon's life or in the story. I like to put a lot of water. So this was no different. At the big climax at the end of the book, there's just tons of water.
One of your collaborations, or sort of collaborations there
Yep.
with Tom. There's C.C. Beck, kind of one of our great comedic stylists with Goofy Captain Marvel. And then your version, which kind of works in that same visual cue, but very different. Your lovely Mary Marble, I just like
I love that character.
That's a lovely design for that character. Then we get to, I don't know if is that you even? I was wondering.
No, it's not supposed to be me.
No, but I mean, that is you that drew that, right? That's
I drew it. Yeah,
that's kind of an atypical drawing for you. That is not supposed
My
to
hair is getting more like that all the time.
And I guess we're getting into it now, but do you like, this is kind of noir and kind of some of the stuff that you researched when you were doing that. Do you like that research period? Do you enjoy?
Is that double indemnity?
That is double indemnity.
Yeah. Are you kidding? Research is the secret pleasure behind comics. It is the most fun. Your job is to sit there and watch noir movies, watch The Big Sleep and Maltese Falcon, and go onto websites. And for Bone, I had an old leather-bound set of British encyclopedia. What is it called? I don't even remember what it's called anymore. Encyclopedia Britannica, which I don't even think they don't even make them anymore. But and I loved it. I would just research things, and one thing leads to another, and it gives you ideas. And I mean, you're not dicking off. You got to be making notes, and it's got to be working for something. But it's the moment when what your job is to get the sparks going and get your imagination revved up, and that's the most fun, I think.
So next. This is kind of one of the things you did for research, another research picture. It's kind of some of your
That's
design.
who it's supposed to look like. That's what RASL's supposed to look like.
RASL's supposed to be related to Commandy.
Yes.
The last drawing from the great Jack Kirby. Now, are there elements, I mean, are there cartoonists that you see in your work that no one else sees in your work?
I think Kirby shows up in my work quite a bit, but I've never had anybody mention it.
Like this one and the next one, I mean, the big difference, I think, between the two, or one big difference between the two stories, is very physical. There's a different physicality. I mean, the characters in Bone kind of run and jump and run around, and certainly some of the human characters have, kind of combative actions. But it's very different, like, that you focused on this lead that's constantly getting beat up and constantly, jumping around and stealing and kind of driven. I mean, was it fun to draw that kind of physicality or have that different kind of sense of physicality in a character? Did you like
because he moves so much differently than even the human characters in Bone were. Like Grandma Ben is still Popeye. She's a human, but she's the Popeye the Sailor Man, right? Not really human. This guy, I mean, even though my art style is still a little cartoony, he moves the way a human would. I mean, here he is actually losing his footing a little bit.
Right.
Like I probably wouldn't have done something like that with Bone. I would have had him actually fall off a cliff.
At this point, yeah. One thing was, when we're introduced to our lead, he's a thief and an art thief, and I kind of was fascinated by the fact that the thief kind of comes from the noir setting, but the fact that he was an art thief kind of is interesting to me. And you have a recurring thing in the book where art kind of sets you in a certain reality. And I just wonder, it's like, is art important to you in that way? Do you kind of, not that you're a dimensional hopping thief, Jeff, but I mean, do you find art important, kind of, that you kind of return to it, that you kind of, it's a thing that you enjoy and kind of, it defines your kind of reality, albums and books and comics? Or
They do. I mean, yes. In fact, throwing albums in there is exactly right. Because I don't know what to call it, my interior intellectual excitement was all driven by, Frazetta paperback covers, album art, comic books, movies, all sorts of visual stimuli. I wanted to make him, for noir purposes, he needed to be a bad guy, or at least you think so. I mean, that's kind of important, that he's a damaged person who's made bad decisions. But I was intrigued by, the kind of crimes like, what do you call it? The guy, jewel thief, heist.
Capers,
Capers.
Or heist.
Yeah, so I thought I would do something like that, and instead of having him break in and steal jewels, I thought it would be fun for him to locate Picassos on different universes.
It's a very lonely book in a lot of ways. We stick with that single character the whole time, which is very different than Bone, which had a community structure. I mean, there's always these kind of interlocking friendships and whole communities kind of affected and whole cities kind of brought in. Is that reflective of anything that you kind of, you're older when you're working on RASL. You have you're kind of set in your ways. Does that have any kind of reflection on how you looked at things? That you kind of, you're a solo kind of player at this point, and kind of.
That's very interesting. Let's just go with that.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if I did think that. I do think it reflected a different me than the kid who started out on Bone. And yeah, maybe I don't know. Somebody else could probably answer that better. But it's also a requirement of hard-boiled stories. I mean, if you go back to The Continental Op or Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett, you're met with a single person. He doesn't even have a name. It's the original man with no name. In fact, the plot line of Red Harvest is exactly the same as Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars.
Sure.
He's a nameless guy who gets set in the middle of two rival gangs, and then he sets them against each other. What's really incredible, I think, in all three of those examples is that you never know anything unless the protagonist knows it. So if there's a mystery, I have a big mystery to tell. And in Bone, it was a much more open kind of a storytelling where if I wanted you to know what the bad guys are planning, I would just cut to the mountains and I would show King Doc and the Lord of the Locust all plotting against Thorn and the Bones, and you would know. But that adds to the tension too, because you know what's coming, and the good characters don't. This is a completely flipped around thing, which is much more claustrophobic. The hero doesn't know what's going on, and neither do you, and you can only find out when he finds out, which is a really hard way to write. I don't know if I really want to jump into that again. Because it's like, well, how the hell is he going to figure that out? How am I going to get all the elements in there to do it? But I think it's a very strong part of that kind of a story, and I think it adds to the tension. And it is a different kind of a character than Phone Bone. He's damaged. So
in the middle of the book, now a book, in the middle of the series, there's a moment where you kind of switch to this kind of storytelling. Some of your loveliest cartooning, I thought, came in this section of RASL, where you bring out a lot of information. It's very differently drawn. It's very realistic drawn. You're kind of drawing from, I don't know if you're drawing from photos in all of these circumstances, but you're drawing in a way that it seems kind of photo referenced.
In this section, it was
all photo referenced.
It was all photo referenced.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about that whole scene, that kind of progression of scenes, and what that was like to put together this very dense, historical, maybe not so historical retelling of that.
It was actually very historical.
It's very historical.
Very historical.
Okay.
I draw a few conclusion and connect a few dots that weren't that hard to connect, but they're a little iffy. I give Nikola Tesla credit for the Tunguska event. That's that big explosion of flattened like 1,000 square miles in Siberia in 1908. That's probably not true. But it did happen in the same summer week that he gave his last attempt to turn on his giant world system, and like an aurora borealis appeared over Long Island, and that is true. But that actually blew something up on the other side of the world. I don't know that. But the idea behind it was that once I discovered Nikola Tesla, which 5 years ago, he wasn't that well known. I mean, people knew about him, but it was just a very small group of crazies that knew about him. And he's just a fascinating character. I won't go into it all here, but he's kind of at the bottom of all our conspiracy theories. Like, if you think of X-Files, UFOs, every possible conspiracy theory that we have, somehow it goes back to Nikola Tesla, including the Philadelphia experiment, which is in World War II, the Navy wrapped cables around a destroyer escort, ran a bunch of high voltage through it, and created a torsion field around it to bend light around the ship so it would be invisible to radar and to the human eye. And according to the legend of the Philadelphia experiment, it worked. And then the ship phased out and actually reappeared like 300 miles to the south. And when it came back, all the crew were like embedded in the bulkheads because they had shifted and which is a great story. And that is a really good story. And the fact that Tesla approached FDR during World War I, FDR was the Secretary of the Navy. And he told him his idea for rotating magnetic fields to repel German mines and torpedoes. And supposedly, FDR, when he was president during World War II, once Einstein wrote him the famous letter to pursue the atomic bomb, FDR asked Einstein to work on a rotating magnetic field project for the Navy. Anyway, my idea behind this section was that this was not part of the story. I did not want to treat Nikola Tesla like a character. I didn't want to go take a flashback and you see him walking around his lab talking to his assistants.
Sure.
What I wanted to do is I wanted this part to be real. I wanted it to feel more real and have more weight and give more weights to the facts, most of which are real. And I wanted the facts that weren't real to feel real. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I treated it like it was a documentary. So in this section, I worked almost exclusively from photos, so that these are real. These are real moments in these people's lives, not that one.
Not that. Let me ask you. Well, let me ask you about the next one. I'm gonna draw some of the strengths I think came out in RASL. One is there are a lot of some straight up horror images in RASL, kind of where the world kind of goes kablooey for a specific reason. And this is there's a lot of that's terrifying about some of your images, and it's the strength of yours going back. Some of your character designs. I think the next one is one of the bone characters that's kind of scary looking. I mean, you have a talent for doing kind of these scary illustrations. Even considering how generally appealing your work is, I think it's really fascinating. What is it? I mean, do you find these images frightening? Do you find, like, when RASL, the kind of lost reality, the reality kind of bends, is that something that scares you? Is that something that you kind of calculate in order to get a certain effect? How do you approach these kind of horror images?
They absolutely terrify me, and I try to draw them as frightening as I can to scare myself, because I think that's important. I think we have nightmares for a reason. I don't know what the reason is, but we have them, and they're an important part of life and experience. And I really love. Like I said, I like pulpy paperback covers, and they're filled with monsters and.
So in the previous image with the hand, that's a classic artist kind of horror that you kind of lose your tool.
It might be. It could be. I just was drawn. I mean, when I was writing that story, it just came to me that his hand would like start to deform and freak out and grow extra fingers. And
So do a couple more.
I don't know. We need a psychiatrist up here.
Yeah, we need. Another strength of your work, I think, is that you, and what's something I find fascinating about the way
is a
you
doctor
work,
in the room?
is that you use these characters that kind of, you use enigmatic characters. There's this character, this god character from RASL, but there's also Rockjaw and Bone that are kind of these free agent characters that don't really have a defined or set role. And as I understand the way you work, what's really interesting about this is you don't really always know what these characters mean either, and you kind of encompass them in your storytelling and kind of let them have an impact on the way you write. Is that a fair assessment of the way you?
It's close. I mean, I do have some idea of where they're coming from and what their purpose is, but sometimes they're not planned.
Okay.
Like this character was not in my original outline. I mean, step one for me is to, once I have the characters and the general, concept of the story, even before I write it, the very first thing I write is the ending. And if I can't picture some kind of ending, then everything waits until that's done. So I had the whole, and then I work backwards and work out some of them, like I said earlier, there are certain scenes that I'll know I want to do.
Sure.
This little girl was not in any of my outlines or in any of my plans. I was in issue 4. He'd been chased through a series of parallel universes by this government agent. He was exhausted, and he just got some really bad news from this agent. And he's just laying on the street defeated, and it's at dark and it's at night, and they're in some back little alley in a barrio in Tucson. And I thought, wouldn't it freak him the fuck out if he rolled over and that little girl was just standing there staring at him?
And I think the next image is, as Rockjaw kind of does a similar kind of a free agent character in the midst of Bone, but it sounds like it was more planned out. The next one, I think, we get into another strength of yours, which is design. And I promised I'd talk to you about design when we were talking about doing this because I think you're a really underrated.
You promised me a lot of things, Tom.
I did. I promised you so much, and I failed. But you're kind of I think you're a wholly underrated designer, and I don't know that I've ever talked to you about what your kind of approach is to design. A bunch of these images moving forward are both from Bone and from RASL of this kind of your design sense, your kind of differences in your design sense. Now, the primary way that we deal with design in comics is this kind of bottom line sale. Like you want a resting image. You want people to notice it on this, and sometimes in a comic shop with all the images.
Well,
but I mean, you have a variety of different.
Bone is on the cover. He's hard to see. You just gotta.
Yeah, but I'm saying, you have these kind of really interesting images, but so you want things to sell, I imagine. But I mean, can you talk a little bit about your design kind of elements in some of these? I guess the next 5 or 6 images are some of your.
The first design element was the logo, and I knew that when you go into a comic book store, a lot of comic book stores would rack them like stacked up so that the only thing that showed was the logo. And I thought a strong logo that would be memorable and pop, be really big and bright and juicy. And I actually kind of based it on, do you remember the original Mad Magazine, like the first 20 issues?
Sure.
When it was Kurtzman. That was a Kurtzman, the original Mad logo.
Yeah.
And I kind of based it on that. And of course, I stole the CB from EC. That was the original Entertaining Comics.
Sure. So when you're setting these kind of stages early on, and there's some more of these, I mean, you want to, as you got on, there's a series of glum images. I mean, how playful are you? How much do you like to mess around with the design? Is there an element other than just kind of moving copies that you want?
No, the logo. I wanted the logo to be a fun logo that I liked. But as far as the image goes, I mean, it was just, I think we were talking about my love of pulp. I have no idea how close to hold this, I'm sorry. My love of pulp paperback covers and albums. And I think it's just that, creating these compositions and tableaus are just very enjoyable. Well, that one you showed earlier of little tiny foam boat on the rock, That was the design I did for. I actually did that in black and white ink wash, and Steve Hammaker laid the color in over that and it's just so subtle. It's beautiful. But the idea behind having the rocks and the little guy, for me, was I was talking about the fact that he's just a little guy lost in this big world. You know, that was the idea. This was the same time Scholastic was approaching us to start publishing Bone, you know, back into the 9 volumes to sell them to kids. And their idea was that you had to have, Bone had to be the whole cover. Like he practically had to reach from one corner to the opposite corner. And they're like, bigger, bigger, bigger. And and that's what I did. The Scholastic books, Bone is like, he's a star. I mean, he is a giant cartoon character on the front of those books. And I think that works for that. First of all, it's a big picture of Bone. I love that. But also, for kids, it just really reinforces the idea of the character. Now, for our books, for the one Vijay and I still publish the black and white paperback, that's 1 volume of Bone, and we alternate between 2 or 3 covers, and that's our favorite one.
We have some RASL covers, you know, because I think those are very striking too. In a way that, I mean, there's a series concept that you go with when you have you want to do covers a certain way, or
yeah.
And kind of work within those parameters. How did you set the parameters with RASL? Like what?
Well, the first image I had for RASL was this one.
Okay.
This was the very first image I had, and I think I thought it was going to be much more abstract and cartoony in the work than it ended up being. As you can see, that's very Kirby-like.
Yeah.
Well.
And there's some of the others. I guess there are a couple more.
But once this set the stage, I kind of kept the idea of the lines and the first, I don't know, like the first 5 or 6 that I did, you know, I actually asked Steve to color them very flat. And then he got bored and started adding more modeling to them. So the second half of the series is much more like the one that we just passed.
Okay. And this is...
Yeah, like that. Yeah.
We'll do
You're
one
fine,
more. We're good. Go one more. This is the image from the book that you're selling tonight. Or this week, that goes on sale this week. What the silhouette? Or can you talk a little bit about the composition of the cover a little bit? How that image kind of struck you?
Well, I think this was an early drawing where I was deciding for myself who the character was, and there's that pulp paperback cover tableau type of a setup again.
Sure.
You know, I want him to, you know, he's a drinker, he's a smoker. It kind of tells you that he's not a superhero. You don't know what's on his back. That's all kind of mysterious. He's got a tattoo, which turns out to be the name of his best friend's wife, is tattooed on his arm. And some works of art, which were really fun to draw, by the way. That was really fun to try to draw in ink. Picasso and Mona Lisa.
Can we go one more? The other thing I wanted to ask you about, this is a really early.
This is like from like the third page.
Yeah, the third page. But it kind of reminded me when I was looking at I think you're also underappreciated as a dialogue man, as a script guy. And I wondered how hard you work on kind of scripting or the dialogue or because you have a very lean scripting style. It does kind of emphasize the drawing does get emphasized because there's no fuss, there's no muss with your scripting. There's a RASL page where you kind of go into exposition. It always seems perfectly balanced. It's almost invisible. I mean, how hard do you work at kind of paring your dialogue down, your scripting down to its kind of core elements?
I just try to make the speech very natural. I mean, I just try to make them talk to each other with real words and real sentences, and I definitely decided early on to never use the little exposition boxes in the corner, and then he walked over to the farmhouse, or meanwhile in Commissioner Gordon's office. I just decided that was completely unnecessary. My thought was, when you watch a movie, if they cut to a new scene, they just cut to a new scene.
Right.
They don't have a narrator come on and say, well, we've gone to a new place now. And likewise, I've felt that any explanation of the drawing was unnecessary, unless it was believable that the character would react to what he's seeing.
What made you decide to do a webcomic based on this, release it for free, collect it later, and monetize it that way? What was it that was directly appealing about that to you? You've told me it was an experiment, but I just wondered what about that experiment kind of appealed to you?
I think the web. I think the world of the web and digital publishing is fascinating. I love the book, and the plan is definitely to have a book at the end. And if you see RASL, you'll see the attention I put into the book as an object. I love the book. So I don't think the book's going away, but we'd be foolish to not think that things are moving more and more to the web. So I think we wanted to explore it and get on there because we kept all the digital rights to Bone and to RASL. And so we have a body of work that we could start selling digitally. So we just began exploring the new world that's coming out there, and like we've done a thing. We're with Comixology, non-exclusive, and they do very well. But we thought we wanted to, we want to self-publish. So we redesigned our website. It was a year and a half of very hard work, not by me, by Tom and Kathleen and Vijaya. What is it about? We want to have a website that's really good for reading our comics, and I said this earlier in a panel today. There's got to be a way for cartoonists to get money on the web. Right now, there's so many brilliant cartoonists, so many talented young people doing comics for free out of love, which is great. The love comes through. But I want them to keep doing comics. I want them to make a living at it. So there's got to be a way for comics to make money. And there are various little models showing up, and people are starting to figure some things out. And the one that caught my attention was First Second, when they published Faith Erin Hicks' Friends with Boys. She had the book finished, serialized it, I don't know how long it took, like 6 months or something, built up a web community, and then First Second released the book. And it did gangbusters because there was a group of people that were very vocal and excited about it and wanted to see it. And then Mark Siegel, who's the publisher of First Second, did the same model with Sailor Twain. And then they did another one, a new one with Faith. So that's 3 books that they did, and Mark is no fool. So I figured he's making some bank there.
I guess what people find interesting though about it, Joe, you're a known quantity. People know who you, Faith Erin Hicks, they might not have known her at first, and the idea being that, you kind of access this new talent that way. But we kind of know you, we trust you, and we like your comics. So do you feel like you're going to get a different audience this way, or is this just kind of, or do you even know, or is it just kind of, we'll try this and see what happens?
Yep, we're just diving in. No, I actually think that we might get a bigger audience or a different audience because A, it's free, and B, it's instantaneous around the world.
Okay.
And when we first started Bone in 1991, I'd say by 92 or 93, the internet, the way we recognize it now, with web, the World Wide Web with specific interests being so well served. Bone was one of the very first books that comics chat rooms, broadcast around the world. This is a great book, and I would see and get emails from people in South Africa.
Right.
We're like, we can't get this book. What book are you talking about? This is a similar kind of a moment where we're going to put this book out there, and it can be seen by everybody in India, in Israel, everywhere, in France. And when we do the book, collect the book, I'm hopeful that there will be people waiting for it.
Okay. We have a couple more images, but I want to we are winding it down.
Thank God, I need a martini.
Yeah. You're doing an artist edition? Has it been fun what do we learn by looking at your original art? This is a series of books where they reprint with color photocopies original art pages. What do we learn by looking at original art that we didn't know before? Is it a, you know? I mean,
Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine it's the same thing that I get out of seeing original art. To go into more detail, if you haven't seen one of these, it's a publishing company called IDW, and they do artist editions. And what they do is they're large books this big that reproduce almost exactly the original art page. So you can see the tooth of the paper. You see every pencil line, every piece of whiteout, everything that's pasted down, notes in the margins, everything. And they've done a series of books. They've done some books from Marvel. They've done a bunch of the old EC Wally Wood stuff. They did a Joe Kubert Tarzan book. And what I get out of those is just, there's something, it's almost like seeing the original art. It's not quite the original art, but when I say I'm with a piece of original art, you're in the presence of the artist. You see, the blacks aren't solid black. There's brush strokes in there. You can see where an artist would change his mind or rewrite a balloon or make a note to change something. And being in the presence of the artist and seeing his decision-making process, I find that very fascinating. I learn a lot. I find I love the work that much more.
You're also the editor of this year's Best American Comics, which
Yes.
sports a Kate Beaton cover.
Yes,
And
my cousin.
yeah, your
My new distant cousin.
Kate Beaton. Now that you have
That
look
looks
back
nothing
on
like Kate Beaton, by the way. She's very cute.
What do you think of? I mean, I guess first of all, I'm just dying to know because of the way that Bone was read and that your work is read. Do you remember the first time a grown adult came to you and said, "I read your comics when I was a kid"?
Oop.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
What was that like, or what is that like? What is that like in general? Just that to know that you were part of.
Well, first of all, when I first was doing Bone, there were no kids in comic book stores, and very few women. It was mostly just us guys, and I'm glad that changed. And I used to sit on panels and look out at the male audience and say, "Guys, wouldn't it be great if we had some chicks in here?" And we eventually, but that did start changing, and so I do remember it took me so long to do Bone that eventually the guys got married and started bringing their wives in, and then their kids, and then one day, and it was probably in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003, or a little before that, where all of a sudden, like, young college kids, male and female, would come up to me and say, "Oh, I read your book when I was 6," and like that, and they're grown up, and all of a sudden there's like the college kids that were little children. That was the very first time I remember that.
So, I mean, as an influential cartoonist, when you put together a kind of Best American Comics, and you're not all working with young cartoonists, but you selected several young cartoonists for your edition. Do you see yourself in them, or kind of see your influence? Do you see kind of?
Well, I don't know.
Is it closer to? Is it that different? Or do you feel like you might have shaped the world in which these kind of newer creators can go off in these directions? It's a very different industry now.
It is a different industry, and while I don't actually know I don't really like see like things that look like my comics, but certainly it was important to me to create an atmosphere where my comics were accepted, and that did force Vijay and I to like break some rules. Yeah, I do think so. Yeah. And I recognize in these young people in this book myself starting out. These are, and they're, you know what? Now that I'm saying it out loud, I do feel like there's a great deal more freedom of subject matter than there was in 1991.